Hello, I'm Mike Buchanan. Today I'm going to read out a script written by John, a British father of 3 daughters. John wanted to tell you his story in person, but if he did so, he'd be in breach of a court order, risking prosecution and a prison sentence. I've heard similar stories from so many fathers and others over the years. There can be no doubt that the police, social services, CAFCASS, schools, family courts and lawyers routinely enable mothers to abuse their ex-partners and children without being held accountable. When John refers to his ex-wife, he could be referring to her either before or after the divorce, depending on the context. John's story starts now. My personal journey of being let down by the system began 5.5 years ago. I'd been in an abusive relationship with a woman for 16 years and married for the last 13 of them. She fell in love with a much younger man and had been having an affair with him for at least 6 months before I found out. She started drinking heavily and using illegal drugs too. She went out at weekends and returned home the next afternoon, hungover, then slept for hours. She neglected the children. By the end of the marriage, I was working 70-hour weeks and running the house as best I could. She was working 15-hour weeks and drinking her earnings away. She told me she knew local drug dealers who would harm me if I made things difficult for her. Throughout the marriage, I refused to accept what was in front of me. All I can say is that I was addicted to the love bombing I had received from the start at university. She had studied me for 3 months and then claimed to have all the same interests and opinions as me. I love my children with all my heart. For me, being a father is the most special thing in the world. My ex knew that my biggest fear was losing contact with the children after the divorce, and she used that to control me. Things were so bad that I didn't have a working mobile phone or numbers for any of my family members. My mother has 5 numbers for me for 5 different mobile phones. If I got in contact with somebody my ex didn't want me to, or if I made friends outside the relationship, the phone would end up broken somehow. The worst instance was an argument between my ex and my brother-in-law. This led to me not talking to my sister for 2 years. When I tried to reconnect with my sister, my ex punched me in the head for being a traitor, then broke my phone. My ex controlled all my communications. She checked all my texts and emails and often responded as if she was me. I kept address books, but they would always go missing. The police were called to the house 3 times, but made no arrests. My crime was shouting at her after being hit in the face and kicked in the genitals. This was a common theme in my marriage, me shouting in response to physical abuse and being told by her that my response was abusive. The police provided me with a number of a helpline for abusive men. I called it and was assumed to be the perpetrator. I was on the line for 90 minutes, at which point they stopped me and said I wasn't abusive, but the behavior of my ex was. It was like a punch in the stomach. My whole world crumbled around me. I desperately searched around for some help, but I couldn't find any. I talked to my ex about her moving out and me bringing up the children, as she'd mentioned these things as an option. She was keen on that until she realised she couldn't afford a nice house on her wages. It was at this point she told me I was still in love with her, and she was going to keep me around just in case things didn't work out with her new boyfriend. She said she wanted to quit work and that she and her boyfriend would bring up the children while I went to work to support them all. I lost my temper at this and told her I did not love her. Around this time, I was increasingly staying at my mother's house without the children. My eldest daughter had been feeling ill and asked to stay with me at my mother's house. While she was with us, my ex wound her up, demanding she return to the family home. I said I'd take her home in the evening, but my ex wound my eldest daughter up so much that she started screaming and shouting in the kitchen to go home. I had no choice but to take her back. When I tried to leave the family home again, my ex tried to goad me into losing my temper. She tried to hit me over the head with a recording device she'd hidden. There had been 3 visits already by the police, and they'd threatened to arrest me. I got to my car and locked the door before my ex came charging outside with my then 10-year-old middle daughter to block me from leaving. My ex opened the door of the car and repeatedly punched me in the head. My vision went blurry. I was unable to stop her because I was sat in the car and in fear of being arrested. She tried to snatch my key from the ignition, but I prevented her from doing that. In the end, after a long standoff, we agreed to give each other the keys that we had to each other's cars. I handed my keys to her. She threw her keys at me, cutting my face and narrowly missing an eye. I was by now shaking and covered in cuts and bruises. Worst of all, my 12-year-old eldest daughter had seen everything from the sitting room window, while my 10-year-old daughter, my middle daughter, had seen it all up close. I reported the assault to the police. My ex claimed to the police that I had tried to run over my daughter and her. I was interviewed by two heavily built policemen. I've read their report on the incident. They were disappointed they couldn't find a reason to arrest me. They went so far as noting that the family dog was excited to see me and showed no fear of me. They decided I was guilty because my ex sounded more credible, but they didn't arrest me. My ex rang my sister on a day I was due to have the children. She did it just before work and told me that the children were very scared of me. I immediately rang my ex and said I would take legal advice before deciding what to do. My solicitor told me to get straight over to the house. I was scared I might get arrested, given the previous incidents, so I went over with my mother. She was a 70-year-old pensioner and the least intimidating person I could think of to come with me. I could have asked a male member of my family, but thought this would be used to stop me seeing my children. My ex later told the police I turned up with a gang of people to take the children off her. When I got to the house, my ex had already packed her car with items such as clothes and toys for the children. The curtains of the house were drawn and I was denied access. My two eldest children were marched out of the house. My ex told them to look at the ground and not talk to me. She gave my eldest daughter her phone to video record me. My youngest daughter screamed, "Daddy," and jumped out at her mother's arms into mine. My ex described this to the police as me attacking her to get my daughter. I gave my daughter a kiss and handed her back to her mother. She drove them all to the nearest police station. When I went into the house, it was obvious the children had been living 24 hours a day in the sitting room. The house was filthy and smelled of feces and urine. The bedding was soaked through and I had to throw it all away. It took me, my mother and my stepfather a week to clean the house. I reported to the police that the children had been abducted. Their reaction was to put pressure on me to leave the house. On my solicitor's advice, I refused. I said the children were welcome back, but my ex could go and stay with her lover. I got a call from social services. I asked them to come and view the house, but they refused. I went to court the next morning and issued divorce proceedings and an application to see the children. Due to police objections, my solicitor and I weren't allowed to know the address they were staying at, but I knew they were all staying at her boyfriend's house. I was driving past it each day to and from work. I even got stuck in traffic and saw my ex and the children going the other way to school. But I couldn't even acknowledge them for fear of being arrested. I had booked marriage counselling with the local branch of a national charity, but my ex never joined me. When I said there was violence, the counsellor apologised and said she had to follow policy, giving me a flyer for the same helpline for abusive men, which I'd previously contacted. The leaflets had a picture of a woman cowering in the background, a man with a clenched fist in the foreground. One day, my ex turned up to the house without warning to pick up some things. She had a full police escort. By this time, I'd been ostracised by many people in the village because she'd started rumours that I'd beaten her up. To this day, there are parents at the school who ignore me but talk to my children. I've been to many children's parties where I get the comment from parents, "So you're him," and then they stop talking to me. Wives drag their husbands away. Despite all the investigations, I've never been charged with anything. The simple reason is that I never did anything. It took me 3 weeks to get back to court, at which point I gained temporary access to the children. My ex told me our youngest daughter really wanted to see me on her 3rd birthday, then tried to blackmail me by demanding I drop my application to see the children. When I refused, I was told the children were scared of me. I managed to get access on my middle daughter's 11th birthday. The judge placed a temporary injunction on my ex's boyfriend, stopping him from seeing the children. He wanted him to be tested for drugs. I went to my eldest daughter's school first and received a very negative reaction from her. When my ex turned up late, she made a huge scene in the school office, saying she'd protect my daughter from me. She sped off to pick up the other children from their schools, not allowing me to speak to them. When my ex and I were together, my eldest daughter had been hostile to her. I had to break up physical fights between them. After not seeing me for 3 weeks, my daughter was hostile towards me. One night I was cooking dinner and set the smoke alarm off. Within a minute, I got a text from my ex saying smoke is dangerous. My ex arrived at the court building with no legal representation, so my solicitor had to deal with her directly. At first, she tried crying in front of him. Then she tried flirting with him. Finally, she became aggressive and threatened him. All of this was reported to the court, but the judge did nothing. While my solicitor was presenting our evidence in the courtroom, my ex started screaming at me, "How dare you?" Then she started crying in front of the judge, then flirting with him, then verbally abusing him, just as she had with my solicitor. I expected her to physically assault me, as she had done on every occasion I'd seen her in the previous 2 months. The judge referred to the state of the house from the pictures provided as borderline child abuse. He questioned why I hadn't informed social services. When he was informed that I had informed them, but they'd refused to come to the house, he shook his head and took no action. It also emerged that my ex and our children had been living in her boyfriend's spare bedroom in his tiny terraced house. The room was so small that it was basically filled with one large bed. The biggest mistake of the temporary court order was ordering everyone to move back into the family home. That was a disaster. The order stated that we were to keep out of the way when it was each other's turn to have the children, preferably leaving the house. My ex was also banned from sleeping in the same room as my eldest daughter because of the influence she was having over her. I was screamed at by my ex every time I tried to talk to my eldest daughter. One Saturday, it was my ex's turn with the children. I went out of the house and received text messages from my eldest daughter saying she wanted a lock on her bedroom door. I replied that we never had locks on doors in our house, and if that was a problem, we could discuss it when I had them the next day. I came home to find a lock on her door. My ex went out to see her boyfriend around midnight after threatening me not to remove the lock, saying she'd call the police if I removed it. I phoned the police, explained the situation with the lock. They said that if I didn't remove it, they would, as it was dangerous. A fire risk, for one thing. At around 1 o'clock in the morning, I removed the lock. The next morning, I was meant to have the children for the day. My ex kept refusing to leave. She sat holding the eldest 2 children with all of them crying. She eventually left, but with the children locked in the bathroom with the cordless house phone and the number for Childline, a service for abused children. My youngest daughter was extremely upset by this and kept banging on the door. My ex turned up with the police. There were flashing lights, screaming and shouting. I thought I was going to be arrested. My solicitor spoke to them, and after 3 hours, I was deemed to not be a threat to my children. Clearly, living in the same house wasn't going to work. We quickly arranged for me to stay at my mother's house when I didn't have the children, and for my ex to stay at her boyfriend's house when I had them. The handover times were a nightmare. If I arrived 1 minute early, I was threatened with calling the police. If I arrived 1 minute late, I was screamed at for making her late. Every time, whether late, early, or bang on time, I was assaulted and reported to the police. Every time I showed the police my cuts and bruises, and the children would give conflicting statements. Every time the police did nothing. They weren't accepting my reports of being attacked. It always ended with a police officer saying, "We're not going to arrest you this time." I considered buying a body cam, but was told by my solicitor that if I wore one openly, I could be accused of intimidation. In the meantime, I was having meetings with social services and CAFCASS, the Children and Families Court Advisory and Support Service. I had a number of allegations made against me that I had to disprove. But how can you disprove a negative? They would never accept any concerns that I raised. The first question I got asked by social services was about my depression. I've never suffered from depression. That was an invention by my ex. The next question was why I couldn't cook, even though I'd been cooking the family meals for 6 months. The next was about my porn star girlfriend, another invention by my ex. This is how the meetings would go. CAFCASS declared I had anger management issues and recommended I go on a court-mandated course run by the local domestic abuse service. They used my denials of depression, a hostile daughter, and the calls to the police as evidence of my anger problem. My denials of having an anger problem were used as evidence that I needed to go on the course. I went into a deep downward spiral for a few days, thinking there must be a problem with me that I couldn't see. When my ex moved out of the family home, it was left looking like it had been burgled. My mother, stepfather, brother, sister, and I spent an entire weekend helping make it fit to live in. My ex had taken nothing she'd agreed on and several items she hadn't asked for. She took all the photos she could find despite an agreement that copies would be made. I found out a couple of years later that she got my eldest daughter to burn them and forced the others to watch even as they cried and protested. The assaults at handovers continued. The visits and calls from the police continued. False accusations to children's welfare charities continued. Letters from my ex's solicitor with false allegations continued. Applications to the court just before hearings continued. The term for what she was doing is abuse litigation. She would file several last-minute applications. My solicitor each time would argue that they were an attempt to frustrate the court process. The applications were always dismissed, but my ex would always act as if they hadn't been dismissed. For example, she tried to get me arrested for breaking a non-molestation order, although her application for the order had been rejected. When I got to work, she would call my personal mobile, my work mobile, and my desk phone, and would then scream and shout at me. I could rarely start working before 11 a.m. Her boyfriend turned up at my workplace, threatening me. I had parents of children at my children's school approaching me saying there were rumours about me being charged with domestic abuse. People who I worked with told me they'd heard someone fitting her boyfriend's description saying he was going to put me in hospital. I lost my job because my ex kept turning up late for handovers, leaving me late for work. I found that my contact details at my kids' schools had been altered. My phone numbers had one number incorrect. I also found out that as far as the nursery was concerned, I was non-existent. They had my name but no contact details. They only knew who I was because my daughter came running to me and referred to me as Daddy. I attended 2 team meetings about the children, meetings between parents and all the childcare professionals in their lives, social services, doctors, nurses, other school carers, teachers, etc. My ex refused to be in the same room as me, claiming abuse. I was escorted from the building as the teachers believed her claim that there was a non-molestation order against me. Nobody had thought to check. I explained there was no such order and was told by the social worker that we weren't there to get involved in my marriage dispute. The meetings were chaired by social services. The teachers raised a number of concerns, including poor attendance when they were staying with their mother, failure to go to transition evenings for secondary schools, not turning up with packed lunches, and more. This didn't stop the feminist secondary school nurse being extremely hostile towards me, implying I was abusing the children. All this time, my ex's boyfriend was refusing to take the drugs test. It was argued by social services and CAFCASS that he and my ex were just friends, and they referred to them as such in reports. He attended every court hearing. Each time, openly and in front of court staff and often security guards, he threatened me, shouting that he was going to break my legs, that he had keys to my house, and he was going to break in and beat me up with his friends. No action was ever taken against him. Due to the uncertainty around custody, I was struggling to get childcare arrangements sorted. My mother had been helping when I needed it, coming over and picking the kids up from school and looking after them until I returned from work. My sister had tried to act as a peacemaker between my ex and I, which resulted in both of us being targeted. My ex became obsessed with my sister and my nieces, constantly calling my sister. My sister ended up in hospital with a condition brought on by stress. The calls only stopped after a judge demanded it in court. The treatment of my mother was even worse. She attended every court date with me, usually with my stepfather. She was very good at stopping the public threats and abuse from my ex's boyfriend. I assume he didn't want to be seen to be shouting at a grandmother. However, my ex started making false accusations against my mother. It reached a peak when the police investigated my mother because my eldest daughter claimed she had hit her. Under gentle questioning from a female police officer, she broke down in tears and admitted that her mother had made her say it. The police response was to drop the investigation and yet again ignore the actions of my ex. My middle daughter was upset every time she stayed with me, telling me her mother was trying to get her to say bad things about me to anyone who would listen, mainly people in positions of authority. This was even acknowledged in the social services report, but they dismissed it as pressure from me. I was never seen with the children by social services. The excuse given was that I couldn't make the times they offered me, but the times they offered me, as they knew from the court order, were times I didn't have the children. Every time the children came to stay with me, my youngest daughter would only fall asleep if I hugged her. This behaviour was used by my ex to make an accusation of paedophilia against me in the court when things weren't going the way she wanted. My youngest daughter was regularly told by my ex that soon she wouldn't be seeing me anymore. Social services blamed me for planting this idea in her mind. It became clear that I wasn't going to win any custody battle, but my ambition had always been limited to minimising the upset and damage to the children. My other aim was to keep them together. I felt that the split between my middle and eldest daughter was driving the children apart. I relented and ended up being my worst nightmare, a weekend dad with some access in the holidays. To minimise the assaults and false reports to the police, my solicitor got the kids' drop-offs moved to a local shop. All communication was to be by email unless it was an emergency, but this only made things worse. At each handover, I was threatened by my ex and her boyfriend. When I asked the police if they would be present, they refused, in stark contrast to the escort they'd provided for my ex months earlier. Each time, my solicitor would write a letter explaining what had happened and asking for it to stop. Each week, I would be abused for getting my solicitor to write the letter. I was getting screamed at and shouted at in public. It didn't seem to matter how many people there were around. They would do things such as position my youngest daughter and any bags so that I had to bend down in front of them to pick her up. They would then spit on me as I picked her up. This reached a climax when they turned up late and parked the car right against my leg, laughing as they did it. They got out of the car and said it was a pity the brakes worked so well, as some people deserved to be run over. My response each time was to say nothing and only speak to the children. I didn't know how to respond. As in the past, when I had stood up for myself in a non-violent way, I would get a call or visit from the police. But my silence only seemed to embolden them. The legal advice I was given was that I couldn't record the incident as this would be entrapment, and the manager of the store wouldn't allow me to use the shop's CCTV videos. My ex's boyfriend responded to my emails with threats, not answering the issues that needed sorting. In the end, the police reluctantly gave him a warning after I kept sending them copies of the abusive emails. The most distressing incident up to this point happened the night before agreeing the new court order. It was during the school holidays and I had the children in the night before the hearing. I was putting my youngest daughter to bed when I noticed bruises on her. She was trying to hide the bruises and she told me she'd been naughty on a dog walk and her mother had hit her with a dog lead. My eldest said what sounded like a rehearsed line that her sister had fallen. My middle daughter lied out of fear of her mother, saying she'd been asleep and hadn't gone on the walk. Years later, she admitted to me she'd seen her mother hit her sister. Due to this and the temper of her mum and stepdad, she said she didn't feel safe staying with them and was only doing so to protect her sister. There was no medical attention I couldn't administer, but I feared that if I took her to hospital, I would be falsely accused of causing the bruises. Instead, I took pictures and gave them to my solicitor to raise in court the next day. The judge ordered an urgent investigation, which social services failed to start for 3 weeks, by which time the bruises were gone. Custody arrangements didn't get delayed or changed, not even my solicitor seemed to care. I also provided pictures to my youngest daughter's preschool club, as I didn't want them to think I'd caused the bruises. They reported the matter to social services. The pictures they saw didn't include my daughter's face, just her injuries. The social worker decided that my mother and I were making it up and called me to say so. She gave me one chance to confess and told me that if I didn't, she was going to prove I had downloaded the pictures from the internet and have my mother and I locked up. By this stage, thanks to help from my mother, I had bought my ex out of the house. I kept on asking my ex for the return of the keys. I asked for a month via emails, which were ignored, and in the end, I simply changed the locks. 2 days later, I received abusive emails from my ex and eldest daughter, telling me I was terrible for changing the locks. In the end, the final court order lasted a little over 2 months. My eldest daughter, then 13, sent me an email, and everyone who read it agreed it had been written by an adult. It ended with her saying she hated me and never wanted to see me again. Try as I might, I have only seen her once since that point. That was just over 5 years ago. At the same time, my middle daughter was texting and emailing me often. When her mother found out, she was banned from the computer and her phone broken. I replaced the phone. I received an email from my ex telling me I was a terrible parent. It finished with her telling me that my youngest 2 daughters would now be living with me, except for certain dates in the holidays. I went straight back to court to make everything official. When I got there, my eldest daughter was already there. I tried to speak to her, but was shouted at and threatened by my ex's partner. Again, the court employees and security all saw this, but did nothing. That was the last time I saw my daughter. She had scrawled on a piece of paper, which was handed to the judge, that she never wanted to see me again. In the space of just under a year, we went from watching football matches together to her saying she didn't want to see me ever again. Just over a year before, when our cat had to be put down through old age, it was me who she came to for comfort, not her mother. In court, she had a different personality. I just couldn't recognise her. Today, I don't know if I would even recognise her if I passed her in the street. It's the single biggest regret of my life that I have lost those 5 years of her life and counting. I can never forgive my ex for the part she played in that. I wouldn't wish the pain of that on my worst enemy, but it explains why I tried so hard to keep my middle daughter going to her mother's. 2 years ago, her mother told her what she needed to do to move back in with her. She decided she no longer wanted to see her. I felt guilty about that too. I felt I'd let her down as she had lost contact with her elder sister and mother. When my ex arrived in court, she was heavily pregnant and shouted at my solicitor. I had sorted it all out. Why does he have to fuck it all up by dragging me into court again? She admitted she had lied to the court about her boyfriend being just a friend and admitted she was in love with him and that it was his baby. The judge sent us away with a mediator. We sat in rooms next to each other, sending the mediator back and forth. I was trying to keep contact with my eldest daughter. I could hear my ex screaming, "She is my child, not his. I've given him his 2 children." Every time I tried to get contact with my eldest daughter, obstacles were put in the way of me having the other children. The obstacles were only removed when I stopped trying to get contact with her. In the end, I had to make a terrible choice, deciding that having custody of 2 of my children was better than none. I still feel guilty about that choice today, but I didn't know what else I could do. The system wasn't helping me and often hindering me. It's a very lonely place when you effectively have to stop fighting for a child. The judge was a woman. About 60% of the judges we encountered were women. And she was shocked that my ex had agreed to breaking up the family. She didn't want to sanction it, but my ex just sat with her arms folded, rolling her eyes. Everything was ratified and I had primary custody of my 2 youngest children. My middle daughter could choose whether to visit her mother or not, but I told her she had to go 1 weekend a month. Any more than that was her choice. She never went for extra times, choosing to spend her birthday with me rather than with her sisters. My youngest daughter didn't want to stay with her mother at all. My middle daughter, then 12, came home from school one day crying. Her eldest sister had left school and she'd known nothing about it. It turned out my ex had taken her out of school and moved her to a new house 3 hours drive away in Wales, breaking the court order in the process. The school hadn't advised me on the advice of social services because they had been told there was a non-molestation order against me. There was no such order, but despite my ex's history of lies, again, nobody thought to ask for it. Just 2 weeks earlier, social services had admitted to failings in dealing with my case. That experience in itself was harrowing. I had the social services management team sat around me telling me my complaints were wrong, although I had documentary evidence my complaints were valid. My solicitor had earlier written a letter of complaint because the social worker kept contacting me after the case was closed, telling me to get out of my children's lives. My ex declared she was going to homeschool our eldest daughter, despite being so clearly unfit for the task. I successfully applied to get my eldest back into school via the courts, which cost me around £10,000 in legal fees. This angered my ex, who then applied for custody of all the children and tried to get a non-molestation order against me. Alongside the application was a 20-page essay written by my eldest daughter on why she hated me and my mother. It was marked by my ex with ticks and comments in red ink, like a piece of schoolwork. The judge decided on this evidence alone that she needed to investigate what was happening at my ex's house. Around this time, I received another hate-filled email, this time from my middle daughter. My ex refused to return her. The judge wouldn't stand for this and gave my ex 24 hours to return her to me or face arrest, so she returned her. My ex wasn't allowed to see the 2 youngest children until after the final hearing. After a week of being back with me, my middle daughter told the social worker she wanted to live with me. The evidence my ex produced in court of my bad parenting further exposed her coaching of the kids. My ex continues to try and take the children back, but has so far failed. The most recent attempt was telling my youngest daughter's teacher that I had been abusive. The teacher then decided to confront me at a parents' evening about this. I complained to the headmistress, who said she would conduct an urgent investigation. That was almost a year ago. I've given up asking about it. 2 years ago, my middle daughter stopped going to her mother's house. At that time, she was 14 and her sister 15. Things that upset her included her mother allowing her older sister's friend to move in. At night, all she could hear was her mum and stepdad having sex, or her sister having lesbian sex. I raised concerns with the local social services. They knew nothing at all about the family history. They were happy that all was okay, and at my daughter's request, they gave me no details of their investigation. I feel let down by all areas of the system, and only got where I have through luck and having family willing and able to support me financially and emotionally. I've come up against the feminist idea of women good, men bad at every turn. As a result, I've suffered, but more importantly, my children have too. I'm sharing my story because the hostility shown towards men following family breakdowns is helping to drive the male suicide rate, the very high male suicide rate. I'm one of the lucky ones, but I still lost a child. I would like to recommend the wonderful Mankind Initiative helpline. I've called it a number of times over the last 3 years. They offer practical support and advice and can signpost you to help, or they'll just listen. I called them at the start of the COVID lockdown when my ex was hassling me. I was on the phone for nearly 3 hours. It's a really good service as you actually feel believed and there's no questioning of your story or implying you have toxic masculinity. I recommend the helpline to every man facing the sort of issues that I did. I need to raise the issue of money. The whole episode cost me about £110,000. £55,000 of that was to buy my ex's share of the house, £50,000 on legal fees, £5,000 on other costs. My mother supported me to the tune of £80,000, including redeeming one of her pensions, and the sum will come out of my inheritance. The remaining £30,000 came from incurring debts on credit cards. I increased my mortgage to pay off those debts. So many men aren't in a financial position to fight for access to their children. Many lose custody and tragically commit suicide in despair. I would urge any men contemplating suicide to call the suicide helpline in the first instance. Thank you for listening to my story.